The year is 1964, and General Motors management is sitting back as Ford Motor Company introduces one of the most successful cars ever in automotive history. That, of course, would be the Ford Mustang. And after that point, the so-called pony car race was on. The amazing thing about the Mustang's introduction was that General Motors actually had prototypes of vehicles that were similar in size and overall dimensions to the pony car before Ford introduced the Mustang. But those product plans were never realized, as it was thought that it was just going to be another vehicle to add in the dealer's showroom and just too many vehicles for them to sell. So General Motors' version of the pony car never made it into production. Perhaps it never would have been called the pony car because, after all, pony car refers to the fact that the Mustang really introduced that type of vehicle to the American buying public. Regardless, General Motors leadership was certainly smarting after Ford introduced the Mustang, and of course they had to figure out how to do a fast follow into the marketplace. Of course, Chevrolet would soon thereafter introduce its Camaro, but Pontiac Motor Division had to figure out what to do with its lineup. And in short order, the Firebird would be born. Now, it's interesting that Pontiac would elect to use the Firebird name because that had been used on a series of turbine-powered concepts from the 1950s. The Firebird 1, the Firebird 2, and the Firebird 3, all highly dramatic concept vehicles that General Motors design really put together as a look into the future of automotive transportation. Of course, these vehicles that were created in the 1950s are basically created now, effectively 70 years ago, and we're still not driving anything that looks like this, but that's okay. It was a neat vision into the future, and they certainly inspired other cars and the design of them as time went on. But for whatever reason, GM management and over at Pontiac Motor Division, John DeLorean, who was the general manager of Pontiac during this time, decided to christen the Pontiac version of the pony car the Firebird. And the race was on to have Pontiac as an entrant in this pony car field. The Firebird would be introduced in February of 1967, so it was a very late entrant to the 1967 model year, and it would come out about 5 months after the debut of the Camaro. Its timing, at least being introduced for the 1967 model year, would also coincide with the introduction of another very famous pony car that was introduced after the Mustang, and that was Ford's own Mercury Cougar, which was clearly an upscale version of the Mustang, and it wasn't just a badge-engineered vehicle. It also was a different length, had different proportion, and many other different components versus the original Mustang. But anyway, back to the Firebird. Now, the Firebird and the Camaro, because they were rush jobs, really had to share a fair amount of components with the vehicles upon which they were based. That was really the Chevy Nova / the Chevy 2. So the A-pillars, as an example, the front glass, and various other components were shared with the Chevy 2 / Nova. And for that reason, many designers actually regard the second generation Camaro and Firebird as the design masterpieces, given that they had their own unique sheet metal. But the 1967 Firebird, as well as Camaro, had to really make compromises on the design in order to reuse those components. Now, the vehicle that you see here is a 1968 Firebird. This is the second model year, but I had to show this one in particular as we describe the Firebird, since it's a beautiful Verdoro Green 1968 model, and I think it's basically perfectly restored. Rarely do I see restored cars that are done this well, but the paint on this car was perfect, the interior was perfect, the engine bay was perfect, except for one minor little detail that I'll talk about in a moment. Now, as we look at the front end of this Firebird, you'll notice that it has the big loop bumper. This is a metal bumper, similar to an Endura front end, but obviously this is not made of polyurethane or some type of polymer. This is a metal front end. But Pontiac was going to this type of a front end on its vehicles and the Endura front end really as a new element of style and something that they were trying to make that was unique to Pontiac. And it certainly looks different than the Camaro front end of the same year. And it has Pontiac's trademark twin port grille. Now, as we rotate around to the side of the car, you can see how beautifully proportioned this vehicle is, despite the fact that it had to share so many components, including suspension components and the subframe, with the Nova. And one of the elements here that I think is very typical for the time and also beautiful is this so-called Coke bottle styling. Notice here you have this significant kick up and feature line that starts under the rear quarter glass. That rear quarter window, the window graphic kind of kicks up along with the quarter panel. And if you were to look at this car in plan view or from a bird's eye view above, you'd also notice that the rear quarter panel flares out around the back wheel. So you have some Coke bottle styling in that the car is narrower at the midsection versus the rear and kind of bulges out over those rear wheels as the rear quarter panel kind of flares upward as well as outboard. Now the Camaro would kind of share that Coke bottle styling element out rear, and the car had a different look to it, but there were quite a few similarities in the style of the Camaro and the Firebird for the reasons previously mentioned. In fact, I believe that the door outers were shared between the two vehicles. Both have that crease running down the middle as well as that little filleted area that fades out partway through the door up top. So I suspect that the doors were shared, the door outer as well as the door inner, the door glass, the A-pillars, and the front windshield glass, probably the rear quarter glass as well, was shared between these vehicles, as were a lot of the suspension components between the Camaro and Firebird as well as the Nova. As a consequence, when things like that happen, it's harder for designers to differentiate the styling between the vehicles for obvious reasons, but take that little filleted area at the top of the door that fades out partway through. That means that area and the crease that is formed at the base of it means that the fender has to mate up with it, and you have to have kind of a sharp crease or similarly sharp crease in the fender in order to mate up with the door. So that dictates a little bit of the front fender styling, even though the fenders are unique between the cars. One last thing to note here that you can see in the side profile is the so-called long hood, short deck styling of the Firebird. In other words, the hood is extremely long relative to the trunk. And that was done to be somewhat European in nature. That was a typical trait of European vehicles. And other cars of the time would pick up on that styling cue. It's kind of humorous, like a car like the 69 Grand Prix, as an example, would have a huge hood and a relatively short deck. I guess you can call it a relatively short deck because that trunk really wasn't that small. But here you have a relatively small trunk, and you also have a very long hood. Again, very typical of the time period for cars that were trying to emulate a little bit of European flair. And as we rotate to the rear three-quarter view, you can see that Coke bottle styling here. Notice, as I said, the door and the section of the car at the area around the door is narrower than it is around the rear wheel. That body is flaring outboard. And the top of the quarter panel has this beautiful crease that notice how the light breaks, especially on a metallic paint like this Verdoro Green. Notice the light breaking and how it's casting a shadow almost on one side of the car versus the top section of the car. Beautifully crisp edge that's just flowing so nicely, and it tapers downward toward the rear of the vehicle. Again, a very GM-like styling trait to have that rear tapered, something that GM styling vice president Bill Mitchell loved. And you have the taillights here kind of emulating what you would see on the 1967 GTO. That theme, that taillight theme, was also used on the 1967 Grand Prix. And here you see it on this 1968 Firebird. Now, one of the easy ways to tell this is a 1968 Firebird versus a 1967 model is that side marker lamp, that Pontiac arrowhead that's on the side. 1968 was the first year for mandatory side markers, and the 1967 Firebirds had nothing there. It was just sheet metal. But take a look as well at the C-pillar and how it just pulls in as it moves rearward, creating a larger shoulder on the top of the quarter panel and an area for light to reflect in that filleted area. This was during a time frame when General Motors clay modelers in particular were beautiful fine artists and knew exactly what they were doing. And that surface just enables the light to kind of pool and reflect and catches your eye more so than if it were formed differently. And as we rotate around to the driver's side of the vehicle, you can see in a little bit different lighting on this side what I mean. This also shows off a little bit of a dull kind of crease on the C-pillar. Notice that there's this dull crease that goes up into the roof, something that you couldn't see with the lighting from the other angle. But so many beautiful features of this car, and the designers did a bang-up job given how many constraints they had and how many parts they had to reuse across the Camaro as well as the Nova. Now, when it comes to the interior of the car, this one also is just a fantastic interior and restored beautifully. All the wood grain here is fake, whether it's on the wheel or the center console, but it still looks tasteful. Notice that in this particular year, you have the so-called safety door handles, which are recessed, that you kind of have to reach into the door armrest to pull them and activate them. Relatively simple door panel, unadorned, no stitching or even vacuum form stitching on the top portion of the door panel. I suspect some of that is for cost reasons. You'd think that the designers would want to have a little bit more flair here, but probably the bean counters said no. After all, this was really just a tarted up Nova and it was rushed into production. So my sense is that somebody said no to making the door panels a little bit more visually interesting than they appear here. And you received 2 round-faced European-style gauges in front of you when you ordered your Firebird. And kind of a standard dash up front otherwise. This one is clearly a 4-speed car. We're going to talk about what the powertrain is under hood in a moment, because this is actually a pretty special vehicle. There were a lot of powertrains offered in 1968. And here you can see one amazing thing about this car in particular, and most Firebirds. Notice that the left pod is the speedometer. The right pod is just a fuel gauge. So despite being a 4-speed manual, this car does not have a factory tachometer in it. All the more interesting because under hood in this particular vehicle is the 400 cubic inch high output V8. So it's got a performance V8 with a manual transmission and no factory tachometer. Well, at least has a beautiful 3-spoke wheel that is adorned with an Airsats wood trim rim. And just to show off the interior a little bit more, you have this beautiful green, gold, metallic, really reflective interior, fantastic looking interior. Bucket seats, obviously. Not much room in this car, either in the front or the back. These cars were relatively small on the outside as well as the inside. I say small because they're obviously a lot smaller than the full-size cars of the era. Now, as we transition under hood, we have the one down from the absolute powerhouse for 1968. This is the 400 cubic inch high output V8, making 335 gross horsepower. And it was only allegedly 5 more gross horsepower than the one down 400 cubic inch V8 and the same horsepower rating as the 400 Ram Air V8, despite the fact that those 3 engines, there were 3 400s available in 1968, and they all had different specs, different kind of camshafts, and different overall internals to some degree. But I suspect that at this point, Pontiac was getting wise to the fact that insurance companies were charging customers based on the horsepower under hood, and so they only rated the 400 HO and the 400 Ram Air at 5 horsepower above the standard, I shouldn't say the standard, but the first optional 400 cubic inch V8. Now in your Firebird, you could start off with the Pontiac overhead cam 6-cylinder with a 1-barrel carburetor making 175 horsepower. There was that. There was the 4-barrel variant of that, which I believe made 215 horsepower. So you get a pretty hot overhead cam 6-cylinder Sprint model with the 4-barrel quadrajet carburetor. Then there was a 350 cubic inch 2-barrel V8, a 350 cubic inch 4-barrel V8, a 400 cubic inch 4-barrel V8, a 400 HO V8, and then the 400 Ram Air V8. So you could get a ton of engine options. This one is, like I said, one down from the top. I believe this is a WQ code 400 cubic inch engine. If you want to understand what Pontiac V8 that you have under hood, underneath the cylinder head on the passenger side, you'll see a 2-letter code, and you can decode that. Just Google it, and you can decode what engine you have. It's really tough to tell what size Pontiac V8 that you have because any V8 from 326 to 455 cubic inches is the same physical size. Regardless, this car, as you can see here, does have power steering, but it does not have power brakes. It just has manual brakes. This is a dual master cylinder car. By this point, that had become mandatory standard equipment. I also do find it interesting that notice there's some bracing here between the front of the vehicle and the fenders. I suspect because of the unibody construction that there's a little bit of flexibility, particularly on these larger V8 cars, and so Pontiac was trying to quell that with those braces that you see there. Those would also exist on the Camaro. Now, this particular generation Firebird would stop after the 1969 model year, and in the 1970 and a half model year, the new second generation Firebird and Camaro would come out. And again, like I said, most designers view the latter as the pinnacle for the Firebird and Camaro design. But I do think that this 1968 model, and particularly this one, this is a super special car in this Verdoro Green. I just absolutely love it. And as I mentioned, the car is perfectly restored, but for one thing. I'll tell you what that thing is. Let's go back to this engine compartment photo. Notice that somebody has put a chalk mark on the firewall here, and the handwriting is extremely neat. The handwriting was never that neat when it came from the factory. It was scribbled because these cars were moving at a relatively fast line speed, and if you ever see the factory chalk marks, the handwriting never looks this good. Somebody took way too much care in putting those chalk marks on the firewall, but what can you say? It's kind of like when people restore their Fords of this era, and there's the caution fan sticker on the fan shroud, and they have the sticker on perfectly straight. They never were perfectly straight from the factory. In fact, they were often very crooked. So just a little tip if you're restoring your vehicle. What do you think about this particular Verdoro Green 1968 Firebird, and what do you think about the 1967 to 9 first-gen Firebird? Put a comment in the comment section and let me know. Thanks again for watching.